Um, okay. Um, the way I think we should do it is, as usual, we go in order. Uh, I think it would be interesting to hear comments on the Moxie article, and then in addition, if you have any comments on how the Pollyanna article supplements it, you should give them. And if you don't, then don't. So, Anuraj, you're first.
Okay, I had read the Moxie article a while back, but I didn't read the whole thing. The first when I read it again, the thing that jumped out to me was the NFT thing, and that how his the NFT he minted was booted from OpenSea. So that was a little concerning that it's still not as decentralized as is it claimed to be. And the and the other thing was that the argument against that people won't run their own servers. Uh, I'm not completely convinced that people won't. Like, I think there would be enough people running their own servers if it was easy enough. And yeah, I think he suggests the solution for it at the end, that making software should be made easy for people. And I think if it was easy enough for people to run their own servers, people would run their own servers. Maybe I'm too naive and optimistic about it, but that's what I think about the Moxie article. And about the Solana. Like, I don't have enough technical knowledge to comment much on it. Passing on to Brian.
All right, I just got through the end of the Moxie article. I did not read the Solana one. What I thought was interesting was, well, there's a few things. Like, this guy considers himself a cryptographer, which probably has its own implications of like some of the cypherpunk kind of mentality towards the web, and like a very, like, his whole thing with OpenSea and NFT was a sort of like white hack experiment of like, how can we tinker on this platform and make interesting things happen. And he certainly did that. Um, by kind of breaking the OpenSea integration and like cracking open the fact that these things just run on a handful of platform APIs, and one of those things could go down, and a lot of this Web3 stuff can collapse. Um, in response to the kind of like making software easy, I think it's not just software. It's like most people don't care how their cars work, and let alone like understand how an internal combustion engine works so that they can repair it when their car breaks down. They just want a car that works. Or you could extend that to plumbing, electricity, how your clothes are made. Like, there are all these things, like, how do they work? Most people don't care enough to even understand what these things are, let alone put the time in to understand how they can take control of that. There's just too much stuff out there to know. Um, so I'm not particularly convinced that um, people want to be writing their own software, running their own servers, or even for that matter, like, the overhead of all this Web3 stuff is kind of overwhelming. I know it is early days. Um, Maybe not as early as some people claim. Um, so a lot of those quirks will be worked out. One thing that I've kind of been pondering in the last week or so is will the adoption of Web3 be hindered by a lot of these quirks that people are just not patient enough to sit through and learn and just just write it off. And I think like all of these technical considerations we've been talking about, or even like systems level of the more soft side of the technology in terms of trust and things like that, I think those will get worked out. It's whether or not people will stick around long enough for it to matter. There's one last point I had. I guess what I just said, kind of the people like in it for the gold rush will move on to the next thing that makes money if, you know, this doesn't become if Web3 doesn't become some sort of gravitational entity to like keep bringing people in and participating in these ecosystems. So I'll have to read the Solana piece. One kind of housekeeping thing is it feels like our articles are we just have too much to read in 15 minutes. So something to keep in mind. I'll pass it on to commits.
Hey, thank you. So with respect to the Moxie article, I think there are maybe 3 points I think that are interesting to think about. The first is this topic of servers, and kind of the public appetite for running a server. In the past, I've set up servers, and I mean, low key, it is a pain. And it's pretty complicated. Like even like in the simplest sort of instances. So I'm sympathetic to that, particularly for people who are not technically inclined. I think I would have to dig it up, but there's this video where someone from the Solid project, which is a project that was started by Tim Berners-Lee, that's sort of looking at these like pods for holding your digital content and then allowing it to be interoperable between different platforms and setting permissions for different organizations in terms of like what they can use and how they can use it. And it's a kind of interesting project. And one of the papers, or sorry, one of the presentations, one of the presenters talks about the fact that there is this kind of like trade-off with respect to the kind of free libre open source software kind of libertarian ethos of everyone having their own server and servers being centralized. And part of that is like an energy efficiency kind of trade-off. Like by having all of these servers in a centralized location, it's a much more energy efficient than if everyone was running their own server. And so I think like one thing that's interesting when we think about the kind of energy consumption aspect here is this tension between like these collective desires to have some individual autonomy or ownership or say in the network and the kind of irreducible trade-off of energy efficiency that comes from that network being distributed rather than centralized. The scale of magnitude between whether or not that's, you know, on a blockchain with the kind of cryptographic proofs that are required versus people just at home, you know, running a laptop or a Raspberry Pi, like it's a different magnitude, but there's still a similar trade-off that I think is interesting, kind of in respect to that kind of gravitational pull thing that Brian was just mentioning. The second point is that I think it feels to me as though I think this speaks to what Brian was talking about. That we have kind of become used to a lot of affordances for how the internet works um, that come from Web 2. Developers have or expect these affordances, websites to be able to do these things at these speeds with these degrees of latency. End users and operators expect these things, and there's a kind of friction or disconnect between the affordances that are there in Web 2 versus the affordances that are there with Web 3 products. And I think that this, the way that Moxie puts it, this gold rush, or this inflow of venture capital is accelerating the space, and there isn't this appetite for a kind of slow and thoughtful engagement with the limitations of the technology as it currently stands. And so there's all these kinds of workarounds in order to get the same kind of technical affordances that we are familiar with and expect now. And so I'm not quite sure how you deal with that, but I do think that's like, there's like a broader kind of cultural reason that the technology is coming up against these hurdles and these challenges to its kind of ideological groundings. The third and final point is that, and I think this connects to the server question. One way that I've been thinking about like what's unique about the current approach towards using blockchain technology as a kind of access mechanism for information stored in a decentralized database is that like if you have like your own server, you manage it and you have all the overhead, whatever, and you're like, okay, that's cool. The primary way in which you grant access to that is through sharing a password, or granting someone privileges through an email. And there's that is like a very administrative, almost bureaucratic kind of approach to access management. Whereas what we're seeing at the moment is a much more dynamic access mechanism. People are able to make art that changes over time based on transaction history, that that grants access or enables access, however you want to frame that, to what is being stored. And that does two things. Like the kind of like the storage question is no longer like the provenance of an artist, for example, but it's the provenance of the network. And it's just expected that it will be persistent. And so the work of someone who wants to have a storage mechanism is to produce some type of art or artifact that grants access to that storage. It's a different paradigm than sending someone an invite via an email or sending them a password. And the reason it's significant is because it also gives a kind of it produces these kind of gravitational pools that are aesthetic in nature, and have the ability to transform over time as well. And I think, that like another big problem with people who self-host is there's this the culture build is always there, of course, but I think it's a lot more difficult to get people interested in something that you're storing if you just send them password, rather than if you have like an artistic product that people can kind of gravitate towards and then engage with that and kind of build a culture around that visual or sonic identity. I just think that like in short, like there's like a different kind of access mechanism paradigm that I don't think is insignificant. It is a large part of what's happening here. Those are my thoughts on the Moxie, and I've went on way too long, so I'm gonna gloss over the Solana paper and maybe come back to that in the open discussion. Jenna?
Thanks, commits. I appreciate everybody's thoughts so far. A lot going on here. My main thoughts, let's see, the one that's easy to get to and commits kind of talked about it is a real question of how this stuff would ever scale to larger and larger groups. So the tension between small and agile that Moxie brings out somewhere along the way versus how do you move fast once you've got a lot of people. And we're already feeling it, of course, inside the Yak Collective. This one nobody's mentioned so far. Right up top, he says, I don't share the same generational excitement for moving all aspects of life into an instrumented economy. And he says all, and so I know we don't mean, we already have sort of chewed on this a little bit. We don't mean all, but deciding what goes on chain and what stays off chain seems to me to be a really ongoing sort of important question, unanswered question. So I'll just put a pin in that as a big one. The other one that I wanted to comment on from Moxie's piece was this middleware idea. I don't think he uses that word, but I know in my own place so far, when I'm using MetaMask, I'm just as clueless as I am when I'm using it asks me to click on a button to accept something, and I do. And then when we were playing on the Colony on Saturday, I noticed for every XDAI transaction, I clicked through to approve. I think there were 3 clicks. And I finally noticed that each click, I started naming them. I realized each of those 3 pings for approval came from a different ENS address. I was like, well, but it was completely in a opaque way. There was no identifying information. And I was just sitting there clicking like any other dumb monkey. So that, that's a big question. How do we fix any kind of man-in-the-middle-y kinds of attacks? And I know we've all, I think, found the notifications inside of Colony to be pretty opaque and unhelpful. So that's a big thing to stick a pin in. And the last one, I did read the Solana piece. Luckily, it was short, and I had already read Moxie before, so I could go a little faster. But when his big finish is, it's time for Solana to start looking at ZK Sync 2.0, Starknet, Polygon Hermes, and other ZK rollups. I mean, he's just not speaking English. And so whether Solana is ready for prime time, this whole piece is sufficiently technical. One of my guidelines is if Anuraj says it's too technical for him, then what hope do I have? So maybe maybe this piece has something really cool that I'm able to judge, but he's definitely not ready for any kind of broadcast audience. So I think that's over to you now, Kiran. Hi.
Thanks, Jenna. I mean, since you talked about the Solana one, I'm just going to flip it and just say one thing about it, which is I think the piece did assume a ton of inside knowledge of like even what the writer was talking about. Because I at least from my cursory knowledge of Solana, there should be ways of performing cross-chain contracts already within there's a particular project within Solana called Serum that should allow you to validate everything on Solana and then just like write your final contract into Ethereum or something like that. Anyway, that piece was very confusing. But I think the one thing I had about Moxie's article, and I thought Anuraj sent the Vitalik's comments on GitHub where he posts on Reddit, and they were really good to read side by side because I'd only read Moxie's article a month ago or so. And one thing that stood out is that node validators should be easier to run than a full-blown 99.999% available website. Something that's available 80% really only required like part-time work at companies that worked at, right? But as soon as you have like the same functionality and it has to be very highly available, that took like a team of 10. So availability is really important as a sliding measure for how hard a node would be to run. And I think Vitalik had a great point where it's like, node validators don't really need to be up all the time. The other thing that spurned is that I hope, and I think what Commits was pointing to in terms of solid pods, I could see something like that, but just like black box versions of servers so that they implement the protocol, but someone could make it extremely easy to run a node validator, right? And I think node validators are primarily just you put in power and compute, and then you get out basically some amount of transaction fees that you collect because of your access to energy. And I could totally see that becoming more and more prevalent. I don't know if anyone's doing that yet, and I want to look it up later, but I think there is a way of making a validator much easier to run because you're really running something that a protocol is defining. It's a common thing. Whereas it's much harder to go run, say, a server for Amazon or a server for, like, if I want to go run an EC2 instance from Amazon, I actually have to get like the API, like I have to run that service on-prem, which is what like the government, the Department of Defense and all, they will do that. They will work with Amazon directly and allow them to run the same software that allows Amazon to virtualize EC2 instances. They can run it in-house, but that's really proprietary. You have to work directly with Amazon. Facebook doesn't work anyone to run their servers. However, all the servers that are on the blockchain, they should be public protocols that are run. So I really think like black box servers could be a thing. And I was surprised, and Moxie is clearly right about this, that there are no mobile libraries to be a validator, or like it's very hard to get access to the distributed ledger from a mobile device. I can only expect that to get easier with time because mobile storage is cheaper than will constantly get cheaper. And I think mobile identity is also getting easier over time. Anyway, I like the Moxie and the Vitalik articles. Over to you, Maier.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What caught my eye in the Moxie article, I mean, I read it originally because it was a big controversy and everybody was all excited about it. But what I found very interesting is the points that he raises, and he doesn't really offer a solution, which is that a protocol moves much more slowly than a platform. And I'll say it like this. When you have a distributed system managed by lots of people, and everybody's pulling in a different direction, it's very difficult to make changes. Now, in blockchain, that is not a feature. I mean, not a bug, it's a feature. We don't want it to be decentralized. So it looks like there's a basic problem that needs to be solved differently than in centralized systems, which is how do you design a protocol, or how do you design the people who work on it in such a way that they don't feel constrained, but at the same time, they're not automatically constrained by the network effects. I mean, why doesn't email change? Because it's a kind of what's known in game theory as I think it's a Nash equilibrium, that anybody who leaves it loses. So if you make an incompatible email, nobody's going to talk to you. So the question is, how do we do that? And in the past, people were happy. You had a protocol, somebody said it, and now everybody's using it. But in blockchain, it's the other way around. We don't want some centralized group to decide for us what is the right way to do and put in the government backdoors and, like a story with the NFT, have a single point of failure where my NFTs that I paid $1 million for can suddenly disappear because somebody disagrees. So this particular need for organizing people is very interesting to me, and that's what caught my eye in the article. I would also like to explain why I gave the Solana's article, not because it's heavy in jargon, a lot of articles like that, but because it does suggest some direction where the world might be going. In a regular world, we expect Facebook and MySpace to compete with each other. Who's going to be the biggest platform? And one will win and one will die. But here he's talking about the fact that Solana could actually become a complement for Ethereum. And not a complement because, you know, the investors decided to do that, but because when people try to solve the problems in Ethereum, they will naturally solve them using Solana and do it together. So it could be that the whole way that the ecosystem operates in blockchain makes this problem that Moxie talks about, and he also has a link to his more general article about it, could be that's a direction to solve that problem. So on to you, Modus.
So I guess I have two thoughts. The first is I saw Moxie's article. I think it's like really clever. But there was nothing. I mean, but I think it's all about like the implementation of these technologies and not about the technologies themselves. And I sort of, and when I read it, I sort of thought about like the early days of like search engines and how Yahoo had categories, and then Google came around and had the linking algorithm, and nothing actually changed about web pages. It was just the way that we thought about search changed. So I think something similar is going to happen with a lot of these, like these services that are overlaying Web 3.0. I think if this becomes a viable technology that people are invested in, I do think that these are temporary issues, and hopefully will be resolved at some point. But they're important to highlight. Regarding the Solana, it is really interesting because I remember when Solana, I'm like notoriously very bad at picking trends, although I'm like at the beginning of all trends, and then I'm just not right. And then when Solana came out, I'm like, oh, it's not going to be, it's not going to be important. I also said the same thing about Ethereum, and I really did think there was going to be one blockchain. And I think that's wrong. I think that I don't think it matters if it rolls up into Ethereum. We can have different. I just don't. We can have different blockchains to do different things, and what will probably end up happening. I mean, it's like an interesting thought experiment, or like analysis, but it's like I don't think it's really important. I don't know what the purpose of it is. Is it like, okay, use Solana because it's going to be part of Ethereum? Like I don't know what the purpose. Like I don't know why it's important. Anyway, I'm going to put it off to I'm going to send it to the next person. Who is?
I believe that's me.
Okay, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. Hi, this is Patrick. So it's kind of interesting to reread the Moxie article in context with the Solana piece, particularly because he's pointing out areas where there's a high degree of centralization within the actual implementation of some of these blockchain tools. And the piece that stuck out for me is, so Vitalik was saying like, okay, like if we go point by point, these are things that they're sort of like on the roadmap, right? Like it'll happen in the not too distant future. I guess the like deep skepticism of that would be wondering, is it kind of like whack-a-mole in the sense that, is it going to be like Zeno's paradox where we keep finding new centralized points? But the question I would ask to that, I guess, critiquing, I guess that sort of critique would be, does that really matter? Because it's, if I guess in this world where, say, for example, where there's Solana is functioning as a roll-up to Ethereum, particularly in kind of like an F2 landscape where, that's sort of a oligopoly, and there's a degree of centralization when you're talking about proof of stake. It's just getting re-centralized in a different way. But I don't think necessarily, sometimes it's kind of like there's the purist thing, like, well, what was the original vision, and is that actually going to happen? Doesn't seem that that's necessarily what matters. I think it's more of, is this useful? Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I think the Solana piece definitely seemed like it made sense, particularly given all the issues with gas fees around S. And it's also interesting in light of, there's a project I've been following around Chia, which uses a different sort of layer 1 protocol, which is, proof of uses storage instead of GPUs, but which is kind of called Chia. And it's kind of always like, if we go in that direction, it's like, are we just going back to square one? And we're kind of like, is this like this perpetual alpha with the blockchain verse? I don't know. It's fascinating stuff. I will pass it on to Venkat.
All right. I'm on a hike, so if I cut out, then just skip over me and move on. But yeah, I read the Moxie article when it came out. And I think my first reaction was, why are people mad about this? Because it seemed to me like, I don't know, the kind of reasonable discussion you have at the early stages of any technology. And then I realized what was going on. It's like most of the argument was between two kinds of utopians. There's like, utopians for and utopians against. And to me, the question of like, is this truly decentralized or not is kind of irrelevant. To me, the question is, does it offer the option of being fully as decentralized at that level of abstraction as it's possible to be if you want to do it with a lot of pain? And if the answer is yes, then yeah, that's an option for people who want it. Those who don't want it and are willing to accept the sort of managed risks of like man in the middle and third-party aggregators, OpenSea being able to delist, MetaMask resting on like one or two libraries, all that chain of like fragility. If you're willing to accept the risks, so be it. So I think if you don't have utopian expectations to begin with, about 50% of the article's arguments kind of like leave you shrugging. It's like, all right. So the pure libertarians are going to get mad and go off to Bitcoin, which is slightly better, but not by much. I mean, ultimately, if you keep sort of like unraveling what's going on, whether you're Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever, at the end, you're resting on chips that are still made by TSMC, and very few people can sort of make them, and you rely on GPUs made by NVIDIA. So it's like, if you want to be perfectly decentralized, then yeah, you kind of have to like be oblivious to where you draw the boundary and then forget that you drew the boundary there. It's like you can have your utopian arguments about, all right, the blockchain levels of abstractions, are they or are they not fully decentralized? And I'm just going to ignore the silicon level completely. If you want to do that, fine. So that part, that 50% kind of doesn't interest me at all. The second bucket of arguments I thought was interesting. It was this sense of people who fundamentally agree. So this is not a disagreement between the critics and proponents of this technology at all, because Moxie is the founder of Signal and is clearly kind of sympathetic to the overall space. So it's between two flavors, and I was wondering what those flavors are. And part of it, it's revealed by the sort of weird insistence on the server as a unit of abstraction to argue about. And I think Vitalik also picked up on this. And it's like, okay, why are we talking about servers? That's kind of not how the stack is really laid out here. And then it struck me that that's kind of like, every generation of technology, a particular element becomes kind of like a totemic fetish object almost. And 20 years ago, people were like, I don't know, super excited about, hey, we can run our own servers and nobody can censor us, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole political discourse attached to being able to run your own server. And after that, it got slowly harder and harder. Like Linux got multiple packagings. There were more layers of abstraction to handle. There was all kinds of like cloud-based stuff that you had to deal with. And were you really meaningfully running your own server if you had to rely on like 50 other services running on the cloud to do anything meaningful? And you can see what happened to that argument from that era. Like you can still run your own server the way you could in 1998, like, put up some Perl scripts on CGI gateways and get directly on the internet, and your only vulnerability is the ISP with which you connect. And look at what happens now. You probably run your website on a similar server, even if it's a box at home. You probably run it on something like Python, and then there's a package manager, and there's like dependencies upstream like that. You're probably making API calls to Amazon. You probably are running Lambda functions there. So it's like, yes, you're still running your own server, but the sort of political totemic significance value of it has kind of like become meaningless. It's like you're kind of like going through the motions, and it's a kind of theater that you're running your own server, because really it's not as significant an act of protest. So I think that's kind of, and the similar thing is true of like, encrypted messaging, which is what Moxie himself is famous for. It's like, yes, at some level of the conversation, if you draw your boundaries right, that looks like a utopian sort of solution. Like if you can have end-to-end encryption, you're sort of, I don't know, in heaven or something. But then you realize what happens in like totalitarian countries. People can get tortured. Their phones can be taken away from them. Like there's no such thing as like a perfect scheme. So again, depends where you draw your boundaries. Okay, I lost my train of thought there. Oh, okay, yeah. So that reminded me of, all right, again, this generations of stuff. You kind of see this again and again with people who are nominally on the same side, but separated by generations. Like, for example, old and new environmentalists disagree on whether or not nuclear should be part of the climate movement, right? And one reason that happens is that old school environmentalists, the climate doves as they're called, they kind of like made their political or formed their political identity by protesting nuclear. And this was like in the 60s and 70s, up to the 80s with like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and stuff. And their entire political identity is invested around the equation that left liberalism equal to protesting nuclear. And now a new generation sees a different problem, different priorities. And for them, that's no longer even good part of the solution. It's a bad part of the solution. And it's definitely not a fetish object. And now it's like, all right, nuclear has to be part of the solution. So now you have nuclear hawks and doves, and the religious object has lost its significance. And now you have an argument within the left that's actually more important than between climate denialists and climate change activists, right? So something like that is also happening here. So substitute server for nuclear. It's like, server is no longer significant. Nuclear has actually shifted valence from like bad thing to good thing. So that kind of thing is happening. There's also like disappointed utopian effects happening here. Like if you look at the early history of Web 1, people like Ted Nelson, who were like visionary pioneers who like suggested a lot of the ideas that influenced the design of the web, they kind of hated the way it actually came about. Like Tim Berners-Lee's version of the web was kind of like, in Ted Nelson's view, kind of like a bastardized thing that dropped all the sort of holy purity test features like backlink transclusion and stuff. And what Tim Berners-Lee did was sort of a pragmatic set of trade-offs and said, all right, we'll drop these features, we'll do what web we can. And that's the web that actually got adoption. It was kind of ugly, what's called like, what's that phrase I'm thinking of? Worse is better, as Richard Gabriel calls it. So the worse is better solution won, and Ted Nelson was angry about it. And the same thing actually, ironically, happened to Tim Berners-Lee himself. Like his semantic web concept was initially utopian, and then a sort of bastardized concept came up. So things like that are happening here. All right. So I think those are my 3 buckets: the utopian objections, the intergenerational objections, and then the sort of paradigm pollution kind of objections. And if you take all that apart, what's left, and I'm trying to think of like what are the serious elements left in the argument, and I see two. One is what Maier already addressed, that protocols have much higher stability. Is that a feature or a bug, and how should we think about that? The other one that interests me, and I think this is actually the crux of the truly legitimate objection here, is if you promise decentralization, build a UX that's like as painful as decentralization should be, and then you make people jump through all those hoops, but in the end, it's like a bait and switch because it's not really decentralized at all. So it's like decentralization theater on top of centralization, creating a kind of like bait and switch. And I think that's a true danger. Like, I like it if it were clean and people who want decentralized solutions can actually build them for themselves, and people who don't care as much can take the risks and, you know, go with like certain trusted third-party risks. But what's bad is if you're told there are no trusted third parties in the chain of events and you're being given a fully decentralized thing, but no, you're not. You're just being made to jump through all the hoops of decentralization without any of the rewards of it. So that, I think, would be a really bad outcome and would kind of like really mess with the future of this technology. So I think one of the, and in terms of solutions, I would say one of the things you can do is just have the right expectations. Do you or do you not want utopian decentralization? If you do go to Bitcoin, you're not going to get it on the Ethereum ecosystem. And second is what you see, what you're actually getting. Like if you're expecting and looking at something that looks like decentralization, are you actually getting it? If you're expecting and looking at something that looks like trusted third party, are you actually getting it? Because the reverse is also true, right? Like somebody can say, I'll be the safe custodian, you can trust me as a third party, and then they're not really doing it and like letting a decentralized solution actually serve the purpose. And then the reverse kind of bait and switch has happened. So I think both kinds are bad. Yeah, Solana article, I have additional thoughts, but it's like, that's kind of like technical inside baseball that kind of, I don't see that relevant to this discussion right now. But yeah, all right, that's kind of all I had. So I think Jordan joined after me. So yeah, passing on to Jordan if you haven't spoken yet.
I have nothing to add, so I will just chill.
Okay, we're running up to the hour, so I wonder if anybody has any final comments about what other people have said, or somebody already posted a list of comments, response to Moxie's article. So if anybody has any additional comments, please share.
One thing I did like is, I don't know if we've done this in previous calls, but I liked how Anuraj had the notes going, and we all kind of like wrote, at least I saw it, and it was very useful to like gather my thoughts on that too. And you could see like what everyone else was doing. So not directly about the article, but I thought this was a cool way of running the meeting, running the discussion. Really. Yeah. Oh, commits. Yeah, this was well. I like seeing everyone's notes, and it kind of was a pointer that I should go to the Rome and also add stuff. I thought it was cool.
Okay, who is presenting next week?
I believe it was supposed to be Sachin, but he seems to be super busy lately. So he may not be able to do it, in which case I'll backstop and we'll talk about Colony. So it'll either be Sachin or it'll be a general discussion on the Colony experiment.
Okay, so thank you everybody for your time.